Nolan Richardson, after he graduated from UTEP, where did he go?
Well, he taught. First, he was drafted in 3 sports: in baseball, basketball, and football. But didn't make it in any of the sports. He had a chance to sign a minor league contract, but by that time he was married with a couple kids, and so he stayed in El Paso and went back to Bowie High School to be the first black coach at a high school that wasn't all black in Texas. And coached the Bowie High School team, an all Mexican American team, for 10 years. And near the end of his run at Bowie High School, a couple black kids moved into the neighborhood, and he had phenomenal success at Bowie, and was able to sort of parlay that into a junior college job in a little town called Snyder, Texas.
And let's keep following Nolan Richardson's career. He moves on. He ends up coaching at a junior college. Then he has a lot of success there. He goes to Tulsa, University of Tulsa, which was a big move to. I mean, Tulsa certainly had a vibrant black community, and there was some terrible things happened in Tulsa way back.
Well, Tulsa has an interesting racial history that most of us have forgotten about. In 1921, the Greenwood riots were in Tulsa. Greenwood was the neighborhood in Tulsa where it was a totally self-sufficient black area. Many people called it the Black Wall Street. And because of an incident on an elevator between a elevator operator and a woman, a riot began, and whites sort of crowded into the area armed and wound up destroying the entire Greenwood neighborhood. There were dynamite thrown from airplanes. And it was, by all accounts, the worst act of terrorism ever on American soil. Over 3,000 people died, but hundreds of homes and square miles of homes, restaurants, hotels, all black-owned, theaters, hospitals, were all burned to the ground, and Tulsa didn't recover for years and years. Well, that was in the 1920s, but there was most of the blacks were dead and gone by that time. But there were still people who remembered the Greenwood riots when Nolan Richardson arrived there in 1985.
And he had a lot of success at.
In 1980. Yeah, and he had tremendous success at Tulsa, and turned that into he became the first black coach at a major university in the South. And again, when we say that, we mean major white university. The University of Arkansas hired him in 1985, and it was a big breakthrough. It's strange. The National Civil Rights Act was 1964, and 21 years later, the first university in the South hired a black man. And it's one of the things I learned, Mike, from writing 40 Minutes of Hell, is that it's one thing to desegregate your team, and it's another thing to integrate your team, but it's another thing when you put people of color in leadership positions. Until people of color are in leadership positions and not just the talent on the playing field, then not that much has changed in the power dynamic. And hiring Nolan Richardson in 1985 was a really profound act.
We're talking to writer Rus Bradburd, whose new book, 40 Minutes of Hell, The Extraordinary Life of Nolan Richardson, is quite a wonderful book. It's a civil rights history through basketball. Those people who are interested in the long road of social change will find all kind of interesting facts and pieces of information that raise many, many questions about our nation and the paths we've taken to get where we're at today and where we have to go. We were just talking about the Greenwood riots, or the Greenwood massacre in Tulsa back in the 20s. One of our listeners just contacted us and wanted to know, was there any restitution ever for that, or is restitution perhaps that Nolan Richardson, not only who coached at University of Tulsa, has now returned to Tulsa as the coach of the Tulsa Shock, the women's WNBA basketball team transplanted from Detroit, who, interestingly enough, has just not only hired Nolan Richardson as their coach, but has brought on Marion Jones, the former U.S. Olympian world record holder, who was found to be using some kind of illegal performance enhancement drugs and did some time in jail, and now she's out and she's playing basketball.
That's right. She'll be playing with the Tulsa Shock tonight at the All-State Arena. I think Nolan Richardson realized if he's going to play the fastest style, that's what 40 Minutes of Hell refers to, Mike. It's the style of play that he adopted, this incredibly fast-paced, trapping and running style of play. But I think Nolan Richardson figured that if he was going to play that style, he needed the fastest woman in the world, and got Marion Jones, who was an outstanding college player years ago. She since that time has had 3 children and hasn't
played basketball.
Yeah, she hasn't played a lot of basketball since then. But it's really exciting to see her. She's clearly the fastest player on the court when she's out there.
If you Google Nolan Richardson and Marion Jones, there actually is a new Sports Illustrated article in this week's Sports Illustrated that talks about the two of them and talks about the misfortunes of the Detroit basketball team that now has been moved to Oklahoma. And tell us, you've been to Tulsa. I think I drove through Tulsa one time, but what's going on there? It's the smallest town that has a professional basketball team, both men and women, or maybe the second smallest. There's a Connecticut women's team, but Tulsa has about 380,000 people. What's the town like, and what's the team like? What do you know?
Well, a big influence in the town is Oral Roberts and Oral Roberts University. So it has a real
conservative edge.
Yeah, conservative Christian, but it's sort of it's a warm place, and they've always embraced Nolan Richardson. I think Nolan really helped bridge some gaps there in the 1980s. And when he first arrived, someone had asked about had there been restitution after the Greenwood riots, and yes, there were. 40 years later, they decided to try and rebuild the Greenwood district, but it's never been quite the same. So there was plenty of scars that never healed, and in fact, there wasn't really any kind of justice. No one was ever arrested no one was ever charged with a crime in the Greenwood riots, and there was just a sort of a mass genocide of the black community at that time, and ruined what many people thought at that time was the model city for the new America. It was a new city in the West, Tulsa, at that time, and I think people thought, well, this would be the way America could be, is there could be blacks and whites could function separately, but also together, and that ended that idea.
You know, Tulsa, or just Oklahoma in general, is such a mixed place. In the old days, they had plenty of industrial workers of the world out there. And they had Mexicans, they had Indians, they had a lot of black people, some of the Buffalo Soldiers who'd fought to suppress the Native American populations on the behalf of the U.S. government. Black soldiers ended up in Oklahoma. And there's a great book by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz called Growing Up Okie. And it talks about the historical situations where you actually had people of all different colors taking on the local, the federal, state government at the time. And then you have certainly the reemergence of the Klan, the influence of the oil industry, and all of the conservative forces there that tends to lead to. It's an interesting place.
Yeah, that's right. But it was not a slave state, and so it was not part of the old Confederacy. And so, in many ways, it was more progressive than Arkansas, where Nolan Richardson moved to. The University of Arkansas, Fayetteville, is a fairly progressive town, and was one of the first towns in the South to desegregate their high schools. But right within an hour of Fayetteville is Harrison, Arkansas, which is the Ku Klux Klan capital to this day. So Arkansas is a strange place, and that was where his next move was, to Arkansas.
Yeah, Arkansas actually has a black population that's probably only 20% of the state, 12%.
Yeah,
maybe?
16%.
16%, and it's concentrated in the Delta. So it's pretty white in most of the rest of the state.
That's right.
And it tends to be kind of conservative, even though we never know if... I mean, you had Fulbright. This is in your book. Senator Fulbright certainly was opposed to the war in Vietnam. He took on McCarthy, and the kind of, the red baiting stuff in the 50s, but on the other hand, he was an avowed racist.
That's right, and he's done he had a great vision of Americans going over abroad to study and spread peace in the world. Yeah. And to this day, it's a great program. And he was one of the first senators to come out against the Vietnam War. Certainly the first senator in the South. And he was great on some. He fought Joe McCarthy with all he had. Joe McCarthy called him Senator Half-Bright. But he was an avowed racist, and he was a president of the University of Arkansas at a very young age. While he was in his 30s, he was the president of the University of Arkansas. So, like Fulbright, Arkansas has a complicated history, and that's where Nolan Richardson. That's the land where Nolan Richardson ventured into in 1985.